it stopped. Oh, and now it said it's back on. There we go. Okay, so yeah, I mean, irrigation is pretty much necessary, although you might have a lucky summer where you plant things and the next summer is really wet and your tree gets established. But the problem is the water is going to be a major limiting factor in growth. So without the water, you'll find that things are going to grow really slowly. So we suggest irrigation to make sure that your trees are growing.
And that could be like dumping a bucket on them every week or something. Like you don't have to have a really fancy system.
No,
necessarily.
No, you don't. But at the same time, yeah, depending on how many trees once you get up to a few more trees, you may decide that it's worth having an irrigation system so you're not carrying too many buckets.
Yes.
So it pays off. Like, irrigation is not that expensive if you do it yourself, and it's not that difficult. It's kind of like Lego in some ways. Yeah, what's the pests? So pests, yeah, deer obviously are a major pest around here, and you want to make sure that deer or elk, for that matter, are not eating your trees. And rodents, voles and squirrels. I mean, squirrels are probably more of an issue on the later on once your trees are mature, stealing your nuts, and then raccoons will also steal your nuts. Whereas voles are more of an issue when the trees are young, and so making sure that not using maybe hay or straw as mulch right around the tree is probably the first most important step. And yeah, kind of assessing what your situation is with rodents is probably the first step, and then kind of taking some steps to make sure that it's not a good environment for rodents. And I've seen, in hazelnut orchards, I have seen rat traps being used for squirrels as lots, just putting them on the branches. So as the squirrels are running around, they get caught. So that's kind of, at a certain point, you might have to have a manual way of protecting your crop. And the walnut husk fly I already talked about, but that's one to worry about. All right. Am I doing this part or are you doing this part?
Yeah, why don't you talk about woven growth?
Okay, so here is this great picture of our orchard. So yeah, the Woven Grove is on Denman Island. It's a farm that my partner and I started, and we get a lot of help from a bunch of friends. So we kind of have a work trade kind of club or something that you can call it, that people come and hang out and garden, and we grow lots of vegetables, and we're growing lots of trees. And this picture is kind of cool. It shows, this is like carrots here, and this is a hazelnut row here mixed with pears, and that row I think has gummy berries. So we're using the alleys to grow vegetables, and then growing the trees in kind of spaced out rows, and that's called alley cropping. And so this is where we've been experimenting with a bunch of, different tools to see how things grow, and also kind of experimenting on the permaculture spectrum of can we mix in multiple species, and how far do we go with that before it becomes too complicated to manage? So it's kind of like we've taken, my partner Emily and I are we have a background interest in food forests, and so we've kind of come that direction. And then we also worked at orchards, and kind of have gone for something that's a little bit in the middle. So it's an orchard, it's a permaculture orchard. So there is multiple species and interplanting stuff, and there's a lot of patterns that make it so that's easier to navigate. And so that's what the Woven Grove is. And so this is a chestnut planting that we've done, and those trees are in this picture, I believe they are 2 years old. Or maybe 2.5. Yeah, so maybe this is after the third season. No, that's last year. Yeah, so after 2 seasons, so they're getting pretty big pretty quickly. And so this is one of the tools that we're using is these tree tubes. With chestnuts especially, they're working very well. And so it kind of acts as a greenhouse, as a bit of a wind shelter. This area was actually not fenced. Well, you think in this picture, it's not even fenced yet, actually. So it these protected from the deer. And they saved us from having to prune the chestnuts, which generally like to bush out when they're young. And so we're getting them up to a 6-foot height where they can branch out and give us a nice, overhead scaffold. So we're not bumping our heads and our equipment. This picture also shows the kind of mulch regime that we're doing here. So we've been using bark mulch essentially from an alder and maple mill. And so
I think it's easier to see in the next picture.
Easier in the next picture?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the next picture. Tree tubes, soil amendments. Okay, well,
maybe the one after.
There. Okay, so there's the mulch. Yeah, so basically what we've tried to do, so there's research from Quebec, it's pretty old now, about growing hardwood trees. Like I think mostly they were doing the experiments with apples and using different mulches to see what was, what promoted the growth the best. And they found something they called ramial wood chips, which are wood chips from hardwood trees but not from like the big, not from the trunk so much as from branches that are under 3 inches in diameter. And basically they figure that was because those had a good ratio of like kind of hardwood core wood to bark and cambium layer. And so we weren't able to source that here, but we could source this kind of like this stuff from the debarking machine at this mill. And we found that it works really nice. It breaks down into a really nice material. And we feel like it's kind of got that ratio of bark and cambium and a little bit of the wood as well. And then you can see around the tree, where's my mouse? There. Around the tree, we've put gravel. Sometimes we use pea gravel. This was more of like a drainage gravel. And that's just to mean that that lets us mulch right to the trunk of the tree without having it get rotten from rotting mulch. But it also is a kind of like a vole protection because the voles don't really want to go through that. The voles don't really like to go underneath wood chips either. So like there's a big difference between mulching with straw or hay and mulching with wood chips, because wood chips are heavier. And then also, same thing. Like if you just let grass grow up to the tree, you're inviting rodents as well. This other picture is, well, we've also planted a bunch of cover crops that we kind of weed whack back a couple times a year. And this is vetch in this picture. And so that's a nitrogen fixer. It's a great bee plant. And so that's been vetch, clover. There's a number of different cover crops that we've been kind of mixing in, and they generally go to seed and they come back. It's always a changing combination of what it is, but it's something that having a diverse ground cover is really nice for pollinators, but also for the soil fertility. And actually in this picture, you can see our friend Noah grew wheat back here. So in that top left corner is in the alley, we had a wheat crop as well. So that's the nice thing about an orchard. You can use the space for a number of years when you for other things if you're so inclined. I'm just going to go back to this slide. No. What happens here? Next.
Yeah. Yeah. And then if you just don't click the arrow, click the,
yeah. Okay. So the tree tubes, tree shelters, we've already talked about. Soil amendments, definitely we found that fertility to get young trees started is important. Now you got to be careful not to over fertilize. You don't want to burn things, but we make organic fertilizers, and we've found that that's given us really good results. We've done soil tests and based those fertilizers on kind of a remineralization strategy for our soil. But you'll see if you go to the Nutcase Nursery website, we have actually created some fertilizers based on a number of soil tests that we've seen in the region that will kind of get your trees off to a good start. Irrigation is a very key thing, as I talked about. One thing we are doing is an experiment with those chestnuts. If I go, wow, I don't need to go back to them, but basically every second chestnut tree is getting a different amount of water. So one is getting a gallon a day, and then the next tree is getting half a gallon a day. And then we have some trees that are control trees getting no water. So we're measuring the tree's height every year, and we're going to see how that works out to like how much water is there amount of water that is is there like you get the same returns by adding twice as much water or not? And what I can tell you so far is for sure the ones getting no water are not doing very good. And yeah, so we're trying to grow. Maybe you want to talk about the nursery techniques.
Sure. Yeah,
we're doing, because
we're also experimenting with different techniques of growing the trees, but ultimately our goal is, how do we get trees going really vigorously so that when they're ready to sell, they're kind of off to a good start. And so we're growing some in pots, we're growing some in the ground, and we're growing some in these things called air prune beds. And so the ground and the pots are somewhat self-explanatory. In the air prune beds, it's been interesting to see the comparisons, but basically the way it works is as we said, nut trees have a taproot, and the taproot's a good thing in the sense that it can go deep into the soil. But when you're growing them in a nursery, like most commercial nurseries, they basically let the taproot go down and then they just cut it. And so you've ended up really damaging the tree quite a bit if you allow a really deep taproot to go down and then cut it off and then sell the tree. And so we have tried to, in the ones that we're growing in ground, dig them out as carefully as we can. And then the air prune beds, basically the beds are raised above the ground, the roots go down, and then because they hit the air, it sends a message to the roots to basically bush out instead of continuing to go down. And so you end up with a lot of really fibrous roots, and the air prune beds are about a foot deep. And so you still have like a decent sized root ball, but the roots end up being quite fibrous too. And so we have a bunch of nuts that were grown that way and a bunch in the ground, and they're both looking great. And we're kind of excited to keep experimenting with what's the best way to get the biggest, most vigorous nut trees. Yeah, you wanna?
Sure. Let's go. And then basically genetics are obviously important as well. And so we've been working on getting genetics that are going to be suitable for our environment. And that's, like with chestnuts, for our understanding, the best for the coast here is a Japanese European cross. And obviously with the hazelnuts, we talked about blight resistance being important. And then one of the interesting pieces is also getting genetics from a nut breeding, a kind of historical nut breeding place in Kelowna that bred a lot of nut trees called gelatlis. So there's different, well, and then there's from Ontario, from Remo Nut Nursery, we've gotten seed from them for like the pecans that are growing, selected to grow in colder climates. So there is kind of, we're trying to continue that realm or that movement to make things that work good for our climate. Oh, mulch. Yeah, mulch. We talked about mulch already. And there's mulch. There's more mulch. So yeah, this picture, yeah. So this is those same chestnuts, I believe 1 year later. So this would have been this year. So this is their third growing season. And this is a hemp mulch mat that we've been experimenting with. And someone had asked about how those worked. They work good. We found that some of them have lasted quite well, and some of them have disappeared really quick. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. I think it depends on how much, like how clear the soil is. Like I think this one where the soil is being very well cleared away is going to last longer than, there was one that had a comfrey plant growing next to it, and the comfrey died on top of it, and the mulch is gone. Like you can't see it at all. It's just like a pile of comfrey leaves. So yeah, we're selling them. We're still experimenting with them. I think they're still very useful. They're not free, but they're not that expensive. And when you look at the amount of mulch that, like, I would definitely suggest doing this instead. If you have the time and the effort to make this happen, the time and the energy, like it's great to make a nice donut with wood chips. Now, this probably per tree, is costing us, by the time the mulch is delivered, it's probably, $5 to $10 per tree. Plus this is another, dollar, say, and the time to do it. And this takes you 1 minute to do, and it costs you $3. So,
and it's definitely better than grass.
It's better than, yeah.
The key thing is like doing whatever you can to not just have grass growing right beside your trees, because it's really going to inhibit the growth and it interferes with the roots.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say maybe putting one of these on and then replacing it once it disappears. And you do have to manage all these things. Like, you're going to have to go and pull out some of the weeds that are pushing it up or growing around, and but this is going to make it a lot easier than if you just left that blank, because then they're going to be growing right up against the tree and they're going to have better kind of rootedness. Whereas this forces the weeds to kind of push out to the side. It makes them lankier. It makes your job easier of taking care of your trees. Yeah, there was something else I was going to say, but I don't think I remember. So I'll just skip it. Okay. You're going to talk for a while.
Sure. Yeah. So these are our nut trees all bundled up in their little nut house for the winter. And, we've talked a little bit about Nutcase Nursery already, but we're starting quite small scale. We're selling potted and bare root trees. And so everybody knows what a potted tree is. A bare root tree basically means that we dig it out of the ground or take it out of the air prune bed, and then it just has its roots. And so if we ship it to you, it has the bare roots with some like moist newspaper or something to keep the roots damp. But the really cool thing about bare root trees is they can be handled and planted and stay alive and do really well as long as they're still dormant. And so anytime in the fall, once they go into dormancy, and in the spring before they break dormancy, like before they start to leaf out, they can be planted and they don't need to be in soil. And so as long as the roots don't dry out, they can be shipped that way, or you can come pick them up from us that way. And that allows us to save like a lot of money on pots. So we're not shipping pots all over the place or sending pots all around. And bare root trees ultimately often have better root systems because they're basically growing in the ground. Their roots are able to go exactly where they want. They're not bound by pots. And so the trees can often be a bit more resilient that way. And we have both options because we also want to be able to offer trees to people like in May, or, pots are a lot more convenient in a lot of ways.
Can I add one thing there?
Yeah.
So a lot of the trees that we planted at the Woven Grove, we've actually direct seeded. So to get the nuts to sprout, you store them, you give them they have to go through a winter experience. So you put them into some kind of wet or damp, like peat moss or leaves or something, and you either bury them or you make it so they're going to be cold. You can put them in the fridge. There's different ways to do it. So then come the spring, they start to sprout, and that's where we're starting to plant trees in pots and in the air prune beds and stuff. But for a lot of our nursery, we just planted them directly in place. And we'd often plant a few, and then we're going to thin it out to less later. But the real advantage of that is then you're never disturbing the roots. Like you're planting, so if you put a chestnut in and it starts to grow its taproot down, it could grow its taproot down a couple of feet in that first year. And then you're ahead of the game in terms of drought tolerance and the need for water. And so we're not actually, at this point, we're not selling just sprouts on the website yet, but I would like to, if anyone is doing a real drought tolerant kind of situation where they need to be drought tolerant, or, they're interested in planting direct seed, you can contact us and we can probably make that happen if you come at the right time. And that's the other thing, is the timing has to be just right. And so for people who I've been, talking with and suggesting, who have like much drier sites, or they have water that's underneath, like a 6 feet down below, they know there's a water layer. Well, that's what I would suggest, is get that tree in there that can just shoot down. Anyways, that's just a aside besides potted and bare root.
Yeah. And we're going to work out that system. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah. And like, I think we've talked lots about how we're focusing on these hardy, resilient trees because we want to grow things that don't need a lot of intervention. And right now we're growing from seed because we really want to support genetic diversity, and we're working on propagating hazelnut layers, and we're working on grafting because there's also a kind of advantage to having known varieties that are productive or resistant to certain kinds of diseases. But we also kind of want to rep for genetic diversity because that is its own kind of resilience of if you have a whole bunch of, this is how ecosystems operate, right? They operate through genetic diversity. A disease comes, or a drought or whatever, and because there's genetic diversity within a species, some survive and some don't. And so we're kind of promoting that idea. And we also want to support community plantings. And so if folks are connected to community garden projects or other kind of collective projects of nut planting, we'd love to share nut trees that way. We also created this idea of quick and dirty consultations. And so if you have land or property and you're excited about nuts, but you're just like, I don't even know where to start, we have this idea of these personalized nut plans. And so we ask that you email us an aerial image or a quick description of your site, just a bit about your interests and goals, and then we'll email you back with a map and some tree location suggestions and some written recommendations. And that's not like the most perfect plan, but it's a way to kind of get started and get thinking, and we can talk more from there.
Well, and I think partly also, I think a lot of people, they like ideas of like planting nut trees, for example, but they kind of get stuck and they don't want to go and spend hundreds of dollars to have someone give them the ideas, to kind of with a plan. So we want to kind of keep the conversation going and make it so people can like take a step, and then you're free to ignore our recommendations too. Like that's fine.
Yeah, totally. So this is our website, nutcasenursery.com. We're open right now for spring orders. And we're working on, this is still kind of under construction, but we do have some solid stuff in there now we really want it to be a resource for like kind of nerdy stuff around nut trees. And so we have a resources tab at the top of the website. And we also want to give a little discount for folks who are here today. So if you put the stuff in your cart, and then at the end, when you place your order, it'll ask you for a discount code. And if you put in CD Saturday 2022, you get 10% off till the end of March. And then we're also having an open house at the Woven Grove, where Nutcase Nursery is located, March 19th. And so that's a chance to come and see all these systems that we've been talking about, and come and buy trees if you want, where we can kind of, show people all the stuff we've been working on. That's it.
Right on.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we start with the questions that have been, let's maybe go through the chat questions first.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest, is that
Yeah.
we could do that, and people could stay muted and just listen until you finish those, and then we could have questions that haven't been printed down. What do you
Perfect.
think?
Yeah. So we did that. We already talked about hemp mulch, how fast does it break down? And yeah, that's done. And then we talked about hazelnuts and flooding. Wendy says, did that last slide suggest that the nightshade family tomatoes could grow well under a walnut tree? Well, I don't know. Did it suggest that?
I think it did have a tomato, and I mean, I would do a bit more research, but that diagram that I used is from Gaia's Garden by Toby Hemingway. So that's a permaculture book. And there are some good, like, more fleshed out resources if you go online of juglone resistant species. And so I would start there. If you're excited about doing an interplanting with walnuts, just do some of your own research. And I think part of it is like it is still something people are experimenting with. And a newer theory is that it actually depends a lot on your soil. And so it's not just about juglone, but it depends a lot on soil and nutrient cycling. And so it might actually be quite site specific. And part of it might just be a process of experimentation and seeing what works best on your site.
I think I would also say in our climate, especially, tomatoes are not going to grow well under a walnut tree because it's pretty dark. So I think a lot of like the kind of things don't grow well with walnuts is also that, like, walnuts are like, they have a big canopy, it's very dense, and so there's not lots of light getting through. So things that don't need as much light might do better. All right, there is a note from Mike Morrell that wild hazelnuts flourish in the Hazleton area. There is a large, nearly pure sand in the village of Hazleton. Cool. Yeah, and that's, so like the native hazelnuts are generally not they're not what's grown commercially. Like it's more of a European hazel that's grown commercially. And I don't know, are they crossing in the?
I think that's part of where the EFB resistance comes from, is crossing native with European.
And there is also a number of like EFB resistant varieties that are from like Ontario and stuff, that are not a part of the Oregon State program. Haley says all of the older hazelnut varieties are susceptible to EFB. Oh yeah, we did this one already. Resistance of native hazels to blights. My understanding is that yes, it's now, I'm not sure about on the West Coast though, because I think the blight wasn't really present here before. So, but I know certainly in other areas in North America, there is much more blight resistance in the native hazels. Also, the OSU breeder says there are only about 1 in 8,000 carefully crossed seedlings that are being bred for EFB resistance that have the high quality attributes that make them valuable enough to release as new cultivars. So that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things with seedlings that you don't know what you're getting in terms of size of nuts, and when is it going to pollinate well with others. So I think with hazelnuts there is a real, especially with hazelnuts, there's a real advantage in, there's for certain situations there's an advantage in having the varieties, because you can plan in a better way and you can run it through equipment, so your nutcracker can do one size. And so certainly if someone's doing a large commercial hazelnut planting, I would suggest that they probably don't do seedlings, because it's going to be a nightmare to try and process all those different size nuts, starting with that. Yeah. And then also dealing with pollination and stuff. Crow predation on walnuts. I don't have experience with that.
Yeah.
Certainly, I know sapsuckers love to attack the trunks, so that's definitely a pest issue with walnuts. Has anyone else seen crows eating walnuts, or ravens for that matter? All right. Brad says their almonds are doing really well. Thank you, Brad. We actually got seed from Brad, so hopefully next year's catalog will include seedlings from Brad's Hall's Hardy almond tree, and that tree is doing really well. How do hazelnuts pollinate? How many would we need to plant? This is just for our backyard in Courtney. So hazelnuts are wind pollinated, and so you would need at least 2, because they like to cross pollinate. And so the question there is whether you go with seedlings or whether you go with varieties. And this is where the varieties also have an advantage, in that you can actually plan on having a pollinizer for the main crop species. But generally, like if you're doing seedlings, the more the better chance you're going to have good pollination timing. And if you're doing varieties, I think it would still be better to have more, because you could potentially have one pollinizer and then have a number of the main crop ones that are producing the nuts. So like in orchards commercial orchards, I think it's like 1 out of every 20 trees is, maybe it's every 10 is a pollinizer. So, then they're evenly spaced throughout the orchard. So that's definitely, like the answer is at least 2, but you probably want more. Except hazelnuts, they are not taproot. That's correct. Yeah, hazelnuts are kind of different than the rest of the nuts in their growth pattern. I mean, they're more of a shrub naturally. Now, in commercial orchards, they get turned into a tree through pruning. And so, but they don't taproot down, they grow out. And even like, it's amazing when you dig them up, you're like, well, you're not going down that deep. And that's partly why they can handle some wetter soils, is because they're not sending their roots way down and getting soggy. And actually, on the wet hazelnut thing, I read something from the Oregon State University that talked about like different quality of land, and like they have, because it's a big industry there, they have it all like charted out. Like if your land is rated to be this well drained and whatever, you'll get this much hazelnuts. And it was interesting to see that like on really wet soil, the hazelnuts could grow, and they would produce, X amount of hazelnuts, but they actually had a calculation for if your soil is this wet and you put the drainage in, you're going to get an increased yield. So it'll be worth it on these types of, on a certain wetness of soil, it becomes worth it economically to put drainage in over time. And so on a smaller scale, you might look at like, well, is it worth it for me to, dig a little trench here and build up a mound where I'm going to plant my hazelnut tree? Because that'll get me a better yield, or it'll make it so the tree's happier and healthier.
And I think just maybe to zoom out from this a bit, I think there's a kind of agricultural optimizing approach that is common in the agricultural industry that we've been talking about. That's like, you plant only named varieties and you space them at their final spacing because you know exactly how each tree is going to perform. And I think that works great if you're planting named varieties, but often named varieties are quite expensive. And it also means that you had better have the know-how to make sure that each of those trees is going to thrive. And so that's one approach that works well. And then the other approach that we're kind of talking about and promoting is the more kind of experimental breeding approach. Like at Woven Grove, there's chestnut seedlings that are planted, and they're planted quite closely together in sets of 3. And one of those is going to, produce nuts faster or be more vigorous or produce better nuts. And so it's a different kind of more dense planting breeding approach where you're selecting out the trees that are doing the best as they grow. And that's a kind of an additional approach that we want to suggest is possible, is thinking about there's like one approach that's like, what's all the existing research, what's the best way to optimize production, and then another that's like, with some of these species there isn't actually established research on what works the best, and so we can plant a whole bunch of trees and some of them will do better than others, and we'll end up selecting for the ones that are best suited to your particular site. And it's not that one approach is better than the other, but that's kind of a less common approach in the context of like going and reading the literature, especially the stuff that's connected to, how do you plant an orchard?
Great. Sharon says, do you do on-site consultations? Yes, sometimes, depending on how busy we are. You can email info@nutcasenursery.com and tell us what you're thinking. Picture of an air prune bed.
Check out our Instagram.
What if they don't have Instagram? Do you have a picture on their computer?
Yeah, I mean, Instagram and Facebook both have
air prune beds. Yeah,
air prune beds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can any of the trees grow mostly shady area? Yes, but whether it's, whether you're actually gonna get good yield is kind of an open question. Now, like some of them will grow in partial shade and kind of shoot up to join the canopy, and that could be a potential way of potential strategy. And certainly like hazelnuts are often an understory tree in a forest, but they're not generally dense kind of conifer forests like we have around here. And so I wouldn't recommend in a mostly shady area unless you think there's enough light that it can really get up and join the canopy. And in that case, it would have to be a tree that will grow tall. Pine nuts need lots of shade to start. Yes, pine nuts generally like to start in shade. Although we've had luck in the sun too, so I don't know. Yeah, I've heard various things about that, and I haven't done enough experimenting to know.
Yeah,
sure.
And there's people coming up with interesting ideas in terms of that. Like one approach is to grow a fast growing thing that will actually provide some shade to your pine nut, and other people have set up little kind of like shading devices for pine nuts. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting they like shade to start, but then eventually for really good production, they want full sun. And so it's worth thinking about a little bit in terms of time, like maybe planting a companion plant that's going to grow fast, and then eventually you could cut back or remove it once the pine nuts mature.
And yeah, on that note, like I've also last year planted a couple of pine nuts that were in tree tubes. And so we're going to see how those do. And they were also planted next to pine nuts that were not in tree tubes and not fenced. So pine nuts are kind of one that, so pine nuts are in that sense, like potentially deer resistant. I haven't heard for sure if that's something we'll see. And also with the tree tubes, I should say, like we did, last year I planted a bunch of hazels in them and they did quite well as well. So there is like potential to use them for a lot of these crops, although it definitely changes the tree structure. Like a hazel is not usually going to grow 6 feet before branching out. So native hazelnuts do not cross easily with Corylus avellana. And yes, all older varieties on the West Coast are highly susceptible to EFB. So that's Stellar Jay is our nemesis. Crows prey heavily on at least some of the large established walnut trees on Denman. Okay, well, there we go. You need 2 genetically compatible pollinizers for hazelnut that also sheds pollen at the same time as the female flowers nut bearing tree. They're not all genetically compatible with one another. That's correct. And that is another reason it's valuable by cultivars for which these things are established and proven. Yes. And that's what we talked about. You can buy named varieties at retail gardens on Vancouver Island, and they aren't expensive. Seedlings make sense for species where we don't have highly suitable name cultivars, but not those where we do have them. So I mean, I think of all these trees we talked about, I think certainly hazelnuts are the ones where you really got to think about whether you want to do seedlings or cultivars. And we're certainly like we're going to be we're layering cultivars as well, and so we will be offering cultivars in the future. But I don't think that, for us, it seems like having seedlings as a part of the strategy to have a diversity of genetics is really important. And certainly with things like chestnuts, I know like there's a lot of issues with grafts. So people, seedlings are some people say seedlings are preferable to grafts as long as they come from high quality parentage. All right, we're at the end of the chat questions. So let's open the floor.
Other questions?
Wow, we answered all the questions.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Maybe people are. All right.
Okay, well, maybe that's it then. Thanks everyone. And maybe we'll see you at the open house in March.
Okay, so thanks guys. And I will send the recording to you, and thanks everybody for coming.
Great. Thanks, Danny.
Okay.